Hello and welcome to this episode of RPGGamer Top 5s, and this time we'd like to take a look at the top 5 Star Wars video games which came out in the 1980s. While video gaming became absolutely massive in the 1980s, and the third movie in the original trilogy was released in 1983, it'd make you think there were loads of games released to take advantage of the name and license. However, this really wasn't the case, and we couldn't really remember that many games. So we ran to Wikipedia to check the release dates of the various games, and it turns out there were only a total of 8 different titles released bearing the Star Wars license. As it turned out, some of the games that we thought came out in the 80s, like the classic trilogy on the NES, actually never came out until the early 90s. A few games which actually did come out in the 1980s were released for a variety of formats, so we'll be only featuring one format, probably the one that the game is best known for being on, but possibly just the one we remember playing it on first. And since there's only 8 games, even though this is a top 5, we're going to cover all 8 in this rundown. So on with the countdown. At number 5, Return of the Jedi Death Star Battle for the ZX Spectrum by Parker Brothers in 1983. Return of the Jedi Death Star Battle is a shoot-'em-up published by Parker Brothers in 1983 for the Atari 2600, Atari 5200 and Atari 8-bit family of computers. But in 1984 it was published for the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, which is the version we remember. In the game, the player controls the Millennium Falcon with the aim of destroying the second Death Star. The game is split into 2 stages. In the first, the player must shoot enemy TIE fighters, while waiting for an opportunity to pass through an energy shield. In the second stage, the player must shoot at parts of the Death Star until there is a clear path to the reactor. Once the reactor has been destroyed, the player must survive the resultant explosion. Once these objectives are completed, the game begins anew in a new round with greater difficulty. At number 4, The Empire Strikes Back for the Atari 2600 by Parker Brothers in 1982. Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back is a scrolling shooter, written by Rex Bradford for the Atari 2600 and published by Parker Brothers in 1982. It was the first licensed Star Wars video game. The game was released in 1983 for the Intellivision. The player must control Luke Skywalker in a snowspeeder to battle against Imperial AT-AT walkers on the planet Hoth. The objective is to hold off the walkers as long as possible before they blow up the power generator at the Rebels' Echo base. Difficulty levels included several variables, including the initial speed of the walkers and whether or not the walkers were solid. The player can destroy a walker by shooting it repeatedly in the head or torso. Shots to the legs are ineffective. As the walker is damaged, it changes colour, transitioning from black, undamaged, through various shades of grey, red, orange to yellow, critically damaged. The player can also destroy the walkers by shooting a small flashing spot that randomly appears during gameplay. On the Intellivision, the walkers require 30 hits to take down, compared to 48 hits on the Atari. The walkers shoot back at the player, whose speeder also changes colours as it receives damage. The player can land a damage speeder to repair it. On some game levels, the walkers are solid, meaning that the player can crash into them, damaging them and destroying the player. Other levels include a smart bomb which periodically launches from the flashing port on a walker and follows the player for a time. If the player is hit by the smart bomb, his speeder is destroyed. Occasionally the player is granted the power of the Force. When this happens, the speeder flashes colourfully and becomes invulnerable for a short time. The game ends when the player's 5th speeder is destroyed, or when the lead walker reaches Echo Base, destroying it. As the game progresses, the walkers move more rapidly, increasing the difficulty level. At number 3, Return of the Jedi, released in arcades by Atari in 1984. Star Wars Return of the Jedi is a 1984 arcade game by Atari Incorporated, and the follow-up to 1983's Star Wars arcade game. The game uses raster graphics rather than the vector graphics we used for the first and third Atari arcade games, based on the Star Wars franchise. Home ports were released by Domark for the Amstrad CPC, ZX Spectrum, Atari ST, Commodore 64 and Amiga in 1988. The game is included as an unlockable extra on Star Wars Rogue Squadron 3 Rebel Strike for the Nintendo GameCube. The player takes control of 3 different vehicles in stages based upon the Return of the Jedi film. Gameplay is from a 3/4 isometrically projected perspective and is broken down into several stages. In the first stage, the player pilots a speeder bike to the Ewok village. The next stage involves piloting both an AT-ST and the Millennium Falcon in rapid succession in a fight against a Star Destroyer. The final stage involves piloting the Millennium Falcon into the Death Star to destroy the main reactor and then race the explosion back out, avoiding obstructions. Although this comes at number 3 on the list, I possibly played this game more than all of the other games, as it was the newest arcade game near the cafe I went to at lunchtimes when I was at secondary school. So it was either this, Frogger, or one of a bunch of ancient old games. And this won out most lunchtimes, often to the detriment of actually eating lunch. At number 2, Star Wars for the Nintendo Entertainment System by Namco in 1987. Star Wars is a family computer video game released in 1987 by Namco. Despite being based on the first Star Wars film, some levels are based on the later 2 Star Wars films. It is the only game in the Star Wars franchise that was released exclusively in Japan. The game is a common side-scrolling platformer, where the player controls Luke Skywalker, appearing with black hair due to colour limitations, as he travels to join the rebellion against the Empire. Star Wars plays like a side-scrolling platformer with 2 difficulty settings, the Novice Mission and the Pro Mission. Luke uses a lightsaber as his primary weapon, but can also use the Force to execute special maneuvers like floating, speeding and stopping time. Energy to activate these Force powers can be obtained through diamonds collected after killing an enemy, called Force Points. At the end of each level, the player must fight one of several apprentices of Darth Vader, who initially look the same as Vader himself, but will change into other creatures when hit for the first time. Between planets, the players control the Millennium Falcon from the cockpit as they fight TIE fighters that try to prevent the ship's entrance to the next planet. The final level involves using the X-Wing against the Death Star. While the film's climactic sequence occurred inside a long trench, the game's version can be roughly described as a vertically scrolling overhead maze-like stage, complete with dead ends and intersections. At the end, there is a reactor duct where the proton torpedoes will be shot automatically to destroy the station. If the player fails to get to the end within a limited amount of time, the Death Star will destroy Yavin 4 and the game will be over. The game is particularly difficult, as the player only has 3 lives and 2 continues, activated with enough Force Points, and Luke dies upon touching an enemy. The Millennium Falcon and the X-Wing can sustain only 1 hit before being destroyed, which can be prevented by using one of 3 deflector shield bursts. The game deviates from the source material very frequently, with the aforementioned examples of Darth Vader having identical apprentices that shapeshift, along with going to planets that never happened in the 1977 film, such as going to an ice planet after rescuing Leia from the Death Star. Notable mentions, or in other words, the 3 games which didn't make the main list. The Empire Strikes Back, released in arcades by Atari in 1985. Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back is the sequel to the vector-graphic Star Wars arcade game. It was released by Atari Games in 1985 as a conversion kit for the original game. As in Star Wars, the player takes the role of Luke Skywalker in a set of battle sequences in a first-person perspective. The game features the Battle of Hoth and the subsequent escape of the Millennium Falcon through an asteroid field. The game was released for various home computers in the late 1980s by Domark. The game was ported to the Amstrad CPC, BBC Micro, ZX Spectrum, Atari ST, Commodore 64 and Commodore Amiga. The game begins on Hoth, where the player is flying a Rebel snowspeeder. The first section is the player patrolling in a search and destroy mission for probots, Imperial probe droids. Imperial transmissions emanating from the probots can be shot to prolong the stage. Once the transmission does end up being fully transmitted, the player advances to the next stage. The second snowspeeder sequence involves the assault of AT-AT and AT-ST walkers against the Rebel shield generator. The walkers have to be either destroyed or avoided, as collisions will damage the aircraft. The player has 4 tow cables, which can be used to take down the AT-AT walkers instantly if fired at their legs. Otherwise, the player has to aim for the red cockpits in order to destroy the walkers. The second half of the game has the player take the role of Han Solo piloting the Millennium Falcon. Firstly, the player encounters TIE fighters and must destroy them. When enough time expires, the player moves on to an asteroid field, where the goal is simply to survive. Once they finish the 4th stage, the game starts back at the beginning of the Battle of Hoth on a higher difficulty level. Jedi Arena for the Atari 2600 by Parker Brothers in 1983. Star Wars Jedi Arena was written by Rex Bradford and is the first Star Wars video game to feature lightsabers. The goal of the game, based on just one scene in the original Star Wars film, is to take out the opponent with the Seeker Ball while defending yourself from the incoming laser blast using only your lightsaber. In Star Wars Jedi Arena, 2 Jedi Knights, one blue and one red, face each other during lightsaber training. Player 1 is blue. The red Jedi is either a human or a computer-controlled opponent. The player controls his or her lightsaber with a paddle controller, defending oneself from the laser blasts coming from the Seeker Ball, fired by the opponent. The Seeker will regularly turn wild and fire laser blasts randomly. The objective of the game is to fire laser blasts from the Seeker at the opponent's shield and finally directly at your opponent by aiming the direction of your lightsaber. The game has 4 difficulty levels, changing the Seeker's speed, but on the highest level the Seeker is invisible. The game ends when one player has received 3 direct hits, and the winner becomes a Jedi Master. Droids for the ZX Spectrum by Mastertronic in 1988. Star Wars Droids is an action video game developed by Binary Design in 1988 and published by Mastertronic under their Mastertronic Added Dimension label, MAD. It came out for the Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum. The game is a mixture of platform, puzzle and action, and features C-3PO and R2-D2 based on the Droids animated series which was out at the time. 3PO and R2 find themselves prisoners of the From Gang, must make their way through their prison, a mining level and a research level in order to escape their captors and be reunited with their master, Thal Jobin. The game reviewed badly, getting only 42% from Sinclair User, which remarked on the fact that this big budget license was being released on a budget label, which they thought indeed matched the label, MAD. And at number 1, Star Wars, released in the arcades by Atari in 1983. For me, this always had to win. When I included the Empire Strikes Back add-on in the notable mentions section, I pretty much signposted it. But the original Star Wars arcade machine is one of the best titles of video gaming of all time. Designed by Mike Halley and produced by Atari Incorporated in 1983, the game is a first-person space combat game using 3D color vector graphics to simulate the assault on the original Death Star. Assuming the role of Luke Skywalker, Red 5, the player pilots an X-Wing fighter from a first-person perspective. The controls consist of a yoke control with 4 buttons, 2 trigger style and 2 in the position to be pressed by the thumbs. The player does not have to destroy every TIE fighter and gun turret in order to advance through the game. Instead, the player must survive for a set length of time, either avoiding or destroying enemies and the shots that they fire. The player begins with 6 shields, one of which is lost for every collision with an enemy or projectile. If the player loses all shields and is hit again, the game ends. Each wave of the game consists of 3 attack phases, culminating in the destruction of the Death Star. In the first phase, the player engages in a dogfight with Darth Vader and enemy TIE fighters in outer space near the Death Star. After the TIE fighter waves end, when flying towards the Death Star, the yellow grid lines on the Death Star spell out either "May the Force be with you" on odd number waves, or name some of the developers on even numbered waves. Although this was never visible in the arcade editions of the game due to the way the display was rendered, created one of the first Easter eggs in an arcade machine, something which had only been created due to Atari's rule of not crediting game creators. In the second phase, the player must fly across the surface of the Death Star to reach the Equatorial Trench. This section is omitted during the first wave of the game. During the second wave, the player is attacked by artillery bunkers, while in the third and subsequent waves, laser turrets on towers rise to confront the player. The player is awarded bonus for destroying every turret. In the third phase, the player must navigate the trench until finally firing a proton torpedo for a direct hit on the exhaust port target. If the player is successful, the Death Star explodes, and the player is awarded a bonus shield, to a maximum of 6. Should the player fail to hit the exhaust port, a shield is lost, and the player must attempt the trench again. If the player manages to destroy the Death Star without firing at anything but the exhaust port, a bonus is awarded for using the Force. The game then resets to the first phase. Each successive wave greatly increases the difficulty. TIE fighters shoot more often, artillery bunkers and laser towers appear in the second phase, an obstacle appear in the trench during the third. Unlike the movie, where the units shoot beams similar to lasers, the enemy units in this game shoot projectiles resembling fireballs, in order to give the player a chance to destroy the shots and defend themselves. Star Wars was converted first by Parker Brothers in 1983 and 1984 to the Atari 2600, Atari 5200 and Atari 8-bit family, ColecoVision and the Commodore 64. The same game was converted again in 1987 and 1988 for the Amiga, Atari ST, Amstrad CPC, ZX Spectrum, Acorn Electron, BBC Micro and Enterprise 64. The game was also converted again for the Atari 8-bits and the Commodore 64. All conversions were developed by UK-based Vector Graphics and were published in Europe by Domark. That same year, Broderbund acquired rights to develop Star Wars games from Lucasfilm. Broderbund published the Apple II, Macintosh, Commodore 64 and MS-DOS versions of the arcade game in North America in 1988. in addition to republishing the Atari ST and Amiga versions in 1989. Sitting in the little wooden cabinet of this game, with a control yoke in your hands, was the closest thing in the 1980s to piloting your own X-Wing. This was a total immersion video game before the term had ever been coined. I remember entering a trance, my hand grasping the controls as I blasted my way through TIE Fighter after TIE Fighter. The game being unlike anything I'd seen before, never mind played. We were lucky enough to have one in my hometown, in the large arcade at the beach promenade, and I spent far too much of my pocket money and time there over the years. Even playing it on MAME now still takes me back, and the game seems so much more advanced than a 1983 game should, and it remains a masterpiece of video game design, which is why it's our #1 Star Wars video game of the 1980s. And that's it for our top 5 1980s Star Wars games. So what did you think? Can you think of any games we actually missed? What do you think of the order we put them in? Let us know in the comments below, or by getting in touch through email or the website. Anyway, as always, many thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you like what we're doing, but most of all, you look after yourselves, and we'll catch you later. Bye.